Hello everyone. In medieval times, there were books called bestiaries that were compendiums, collections of information and illustrations about animals, beasts. These bestiaries mixed real and legendary animals. I'll tell you more about these historical bestiaries later in this episode, in the sections about unicorns and mermaids. But for tonight, based on old and more recent episodes, I have put together a kind of bestiary that includes legendary and mythical creatures like dragons, werewolves or unicorns, and creatures from fantasy literature and film that are also based on old myths and folk tales but took their current shape in modern times. Creatures like elves, dwarves, orcs or goblins. So we have a long exploration journey ahead of us, one that will blend history, folklore, mythology, literature, or anthropology. And without further ado, let's begin with our first creature, our first archetype, the elf. Of the different creatures I'm going to tell you about tonight, the elves are probably one of the most standardized, and they owe their template mostly to Tolkien. His version of elves set the standard that almost everything since the 1950s copies, adapts, or plays with, adding twists and variants. The characteristics of fantasy elves in Tolkien's world are rather well known. Elves are tall, maybe 6 or 7 feet. They are slender and graceful. They look either youthful or ageless, with luminous skin and silver, gold or dark hair. They are extremely long-lived, or even immortal. Only wounds can kill them, or deep grief that makes them choose death. In terms of personality, they are wise. They can be a bit arrogant or distant, and they also appear deeply connected to nature. They live in ancient forests or elegant hidden cities. They are also a very ancient civilization that once was greater and declined, not necessarily because they were defeated, but because they lost interest in dominating the world. Still, they have kept physical abilities that make them superior to humans. They have acute senses, hearing or sight. They are faster. They are excellent with bows, and some of them have magic powers. This version of the elves is sometimes subverted with another kind of elves in fantasy worlds. Darker elves that would be decadent and cruel. But the obvious father of the elf archetype is Tolkien. So how did he invent the modern fantasy elf? By drawing inspiration from Germanic and Norse mythologies and adding influences from different folklores, English, Scandinavian, and maybe Celtic folklores. The modern English word elf derives from Old English aelf, which itself came from Proto-Germanic albis or albas, meaning bright or white. In the Old Norse language, the language of the Vikings. It gave Alfr, and in Old German, Alp. So the etymology of the name elf ties to concepts of luminous, beautiful beings. In Norse mythology, elves appear as a distinct category of beings, living in their own separate world, Alfheim, literally the home of elves. Sources of Norse mythology are scarce, and written works about it are from the very late period of the Old Norse culture, as it was already fading away. So this description of elves is to be taken with a grain of salt. It does not necessarily perfectly reflect how they were seen during the various centuries of Norse culture. But this is what Tolkien had at his disposal. Still, in Old Norse mythology, it seems that elves divided into light and dark or black elves. Light elves were seen as heavenly beings, fairer than the sun, that embodied light, beauty, benevolence and healing, so very positive creatures, but almost divine. They were placed on a level that seemed equivalent to the gods of Asgard, so not the kind of creature that humans would encounter in their world on Midgard. The other type of elves, the dark ones, were described as subterranean dwellers, also with their own world, Svartalfheim. They were associated with craftsmanship. They would forge magical artifacts, for example. Different scholars think that these dark elves were equivalent to the dwarves, that also were a separate race of creatures. One of the main written sources of information about Norse mythology is called the Prose Edda. It is a work by Snorri Sturluson, a scholar who lived in Iceland in the 13th century, and his compilation of myth reflects the late tradition of Norse mythology. But maybe he added elements of his own, so he could have decided to unite elves and dwarfs as two opposite types of elves. In any case, Tolkien drew on this opposition that seems to have inspired the mutual dislike of dwarves and elves in his novels. So, Norse, and more broadly Germanic myth, because Norse mythology is a branch of Germanic mythology, have elves that are ambivalent, light or dark, and in these ancient stories they can either help humans by healing them or bringing fertility to our world, or they may harm them by bringing illness or madness. Still, based on what we know of Germanic and Norse mythology, the limited sources we have, they remain rather undefined. There is one story explicitly involving an elf as the main character in Germanic mythology, a story that illustrates the ambivalent nature of these mythological elves. They were talented, but they could also seek revenge from humans and take pleasure in it. It is the story of Völundr, and it goes like this. Völundr was an elf with great talent in the forging of rings and other jewels. He had 2 brothers, and for a few years the 3 of them lived with swan maidens, supernatural women that they had seduced, taking the appearance of swans too. But one day, the swan women flew away. They were immortal. The brothers were not, and they didn't want to stay bound to mortals any longer. The two other brothers tried to search for their wives, but Felundr stayed behind, and instead he went to live on an island, where he dedicated himself to forge wonderful artifacts. His skills did wonders, and he amassed a fortune. But a king in Sweden, Nidud, heard of the talent and great wealth of Felundr. He was greedy and wanted to appropriate both. So he sent men to capture him in his sleep. They seized Felundr, bound him, and brought him to the king. Nidud was ruthless and cruel. In order to avoid any escape of his prisoner, he ordered his knees to be broken, and then he forced him to work as a captive smith on an isolated island that belonged to him. In captivity, Felundr plotted revenge for this injustice. He attracted the two young sons of the king to his forge. There, he killed them and hid their bodies. No one knew where or why the two sons had disappeared, which deeply affected the king. But Felundr had imagined a more cruel kind of retribution. He used the skulls of the sons to set them in silver and make drinking bowls. From their eyes he made jewels, and from their teeth he made brooches, which he all sent to the king as gifts. The items were so well made that the king and the queen did not suspect anything, so they used them, unknowingly drinking in their sons' skulls, and wearing their sons' eyes and teeth as ornaments. But that was not enough. Later, the king's daughter visited him and asked that he repair the broken ring that she had damaged. Felundr got her drunk with beer, and right after that, he was able to escape. He had patiently gathered feathers from which he crafted wings that enabled him to fly away from his prison island. He considered himself almost avenged, but not quite. So he flew over the king's hall to taunt him, revealing the fate of his sons, before flying away under the arrows of the king's archers, unable to reach him. The story ends with Felundr soaring free, while the king grieves his losses. So that story is quite revealing about what these dark elves are capable of in Germanic myth. They are not nice beings. They have powers or extraordinary skills, but they can be ruthless, and any encounter with them can turn out to be very dangerous. At this point, though, elves are not immortal. They are not particularly connected to nature, and not much is said about their height or appearance. They gained these characteristics later in the Germanic and especially Anglo-Saxon folklore that emerged over time during the Middle Ages, especially toward the beginning of the medieval period. In this medieval Anglo-Saxon and also Scandinavian folklore, elves start to be associated with wild places, especially forests that they would protect from human interference. They also gained a more defined appearance. They are now human-sized, and they practice archery. That's a defining feature of their character. Elves are creatures that also avoid direct confrontation and don't go into physical fights with anyone. They interact with humans in more subtle and indirect ways. They seduce, they abduct also. In medieval England, they are among the creatures that are suspected to be responsible for the abduction of babies or very young children. Babies that would be replaced by changelings, these fake humans that would reveal their true nature later, when they would be growing up. Still, in Anglo-Saxon folklore, they fight at a distance with their bows. So the elves are defined by this elusiveness. They are a threat that is impossible to precisely identify and catch, which makes them dangerous, but also intriguing and seductive in their mystery. So some of these traits, like archery, the guardianship of forests, and the human-like size, are add-ons to the figure of the elf that come from Northern and Western European folklore. But the evolution from mythology and folklore elves to the modern fantasy elves was not straightforward, because for the rest of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, elves shrank, literally. They became tiny creatures that are closer to what we call fairies. Now, medieval or Renaissance fairies were not the cute little winged creatures, the winged women of today. They were more sinister than that. Fairies were believed to be forgotten pagan deities or spirits of the dead, or even fallen angels, demons, that populated our world. And they were seen as rather dangerous. On top of abducting babies, they would play pranks, cause people to lose their way when traveling in wild regions, or they would steal objects. In the rare depictions of fairies we have from the Middle Ages, they are shown as little dark-winged creatures, rather ugly and demonic in appearance. So in English folklore, elves and fairies became almost synonyms. And they were not always malevolent, but they could be dangerous to deal with. That's a way of imagining them that lasted after the Middle Ages. For example, the way elves/fairies are depicted by Shakespeare in A Midsummer Night's Dream illustrates how they have become tiny creatures. And it is this version of the elves that inspired much more engaging figures in the 19th century, like the modern fairy, or the Christmas elf, which became particularly popular in America. Christmas elves are small toy makers. They are helpful and kind. So quite different from the ancient mythological elves. But they are still offsprings of the mythological elves, shrank in size in English folklore and reinvented as cuter creatures in the 19th century. At the time, in the 19th century, all the superstitions about supposedly malevolent elves and fairies had disappeared in depth in European population, which left space for a reinvention. Fairies were reinvented too, in the Victorian era, as these cute, winged creatures that remain popular with children. So the Disney-style fairy, like the Christmas elf, are for a part descendants of the old Germanic mythology, transformed by medieval folklore and reimagined, stripped of the negative traits they used to have. Returning to fantasy elves, the synthesis made by Tolkien consisted in mostly ignoring the tiny elves of the Middle Ages and returning to the more ancient sense of elves as larger, powerful, and beautiful beings from wild places. Tolkien was extremely well versed in Old English, Germanic, and Norse lore, and from them he collected the various traits he gave to his elves. Nowadays they seem so obvious in popular culture, but when he shaped his elves, they were a type of creature that had no direct equivalent in fantasy. He imagined them from these various sources. A more controversial source of inspiration for his elves is Celtic influence. Tolkien denied it. He wanted them to be rooted in Anglo-Saxon and Norse mythologies. But at the same time, there are narrative parallels between his elves and Celtic, specifically Irish mythology. And also Celtic tradition contributed to the fairy archetype that would later merge with elves in the Middle Ages. What are these parallels? In Irish mythology, there is a race of supernatural beings, the Tuatha Dé Danann. Their name translates to the people or the tribe of the goddess Danu. They are regarded as representing the pre-Christian deities of Ireland. Among them are the Dagda, a father god figure, Nuada, a warrior god, Lug, a hero that masters all arts, Brigid, the goddess of poetry and healing, the Morrigan, a war goddess that is believed to appear in tribal form, and many others. In different texts, these divine beings of the Tuatha Dé Danann share a lot with Tolkien's elves. They are described as tall, slender, beautiful, mastering magic, art, sciences, and warfare. They glow with otherworldly light and aura. They are also immortal, but killable in battles. They sometimes mingle with humans, but they can disappear into hidden realms. And they appear as superhumans in general, looking like an idealized version of human beings. They are also seductive, and they may abduct people. And narratively, the backstory of the elven race that Tolkien came up with echoes Celtic legends too, with elements like parts of the elves moving to the land of humans in ancient times, like the Tuatha Dé Danann folks. And after centuries and centuries, retreating to their land of origin or fading as a race, becoming the nostalgic remains of an ancient splendor or domination. So, consciously or not, it seems Tolkien also drew on this Celtic heritage to create at least the lore of his elves. He also suggested they had pointed ears, something that did not particularly appear before, I say suggested, because he didn't emphasize this much. He just said that hobbits had slightly pointed and elvish ears. The stereotypical sharply pointed ears that elves are often pictured with actually appeared after Tolkien, in art, in Dungeons and Dragons and films, and it seems to have been inspired by fairy folklore and the 19th century depictions of fairies, merging once again with elves. And this is how, after all these centuries, back and forth, and with the decisive influence of Tolkien, this modern fantasy elf archetype was born. A type of creature that embodies nobility, melancholy or nostalgia for an ancient fallen world, ancient wisdom, harmony with nature, together with superhuman senses and physical abilities. Fantasy literature, movies or games embraced this template, and it is immediately recognizable. But each individual work also often plays with it, adding or eliminating traits, or exploring the possibilities created by the characteristics of this race. Cultural decline, the burden of immortality, from knowing that life will never end, to interacting with mortal races that have a short lifespan, or the attitudes and feelings of superiority that these extraordinary characteristics give to the elves. There could be many more things to say about them, but let's move to a second race, one that has the reputation to dislike elves, the dwarves. We all know how standard fantasy dwarves are pictured. They are short, at around 4 or 5 feet, with strong builds and broad shoulders, suited to physical labor and close combat. Male dwarves typically have beards, long and sometimes braided beards, and culturally they are associated with mining, blacksmithing, and craftsmanship. They dwell in vast underground kingdoms, carved into mountains, filled with halls, forges, or treasure vaults. They are renowned for their engineering prowess. If one fantasy race is close to the Industrial Revolution, it is them. They create intricate weapons, armor, and artifacts that are widely admired. Personality-wise, the stereotype is that they are pragmatic, down to earth. They can also be stubborn and greedy. They are often isolationist or at least suspicious of any other race. But they always have a deep sense of honor and loyalty to their clan. They also like feasts, beer. Typically, once they engage with other races, they become rather likable because they are predictable, honest, and reliable. They are also fierce warriors, favoring axes, hammers, and heavy armor, excelling in sieges and defensive tactics. Again, the standard for fantasy dwarves owes a lot to Tolkien, who set it up. And contrary to other creatures that can vary significantly between authors, games, or films, dwarves are very often rather consistent across media. Sometimes they have a darker counterpart, corrupt or chaos dwarves, but this only solidifies the template by making regular dwarves appear in a better light. Here again, these dwarves were born from a reimagining of ancient sources and modern add-ons. However different, they are connected to ancestors in mythology, and they have fairy tale cousins too, like the dwarves in Snow White. The earliest depictions of dwarf-like creatures trace back to Norse mythology. The Norse ancestors of dwarves were earth spirits or dark elves, dwelling in Svartalfheim, one of the 9 worlds. In the sources we have, they are not described as particularly short. So why consider them ancestors of fantasy dwarves? Because they live underground, they are skilled in mining and metallurgy, and they forge extraordinary objects, like the hammer of Thor or the spear of Odin. They are master artisans who trade with gods. They are capable of curses or shape-shifting, a characteristic that has disappeared from fantasy dwarves. One that hasn't is that they also hold grudges. In broader Germanic folklore, dwarves acquire other characteristics that make them closer to the fantasy archetype. In sagas and fairy tales, they become short, and they always dwell underground, where they guard treasures. These are the characteristics of a well-known dwarf, the one from the Nibelungenlied. The Nibelungenlied is the medieval epic that inspired other works, the most famous being the Ring of the Nibelung, the opera cycle written by Richard Wagner in the 19th century. But the original epic is from the 13th century. And in it, the main character is a dwarf king, Alberich, who possesses a magical cloak of invisibility and a treasure in gold. These dwarf figures retain the ambivalence of their ancestors in mythology. They can be helpful if respected, but they turn malevolent and vengeful if their interests are at risk or if they are wronged. They are also associated with mountains, caves, and mining. Now, medieval Europe had other comparable figures of dwarves that presented the same kind of ambivalence, such as the leprechauns in Ireland or the trolls in Scotland, Trow. Leprechauns are more famous, but these Scottish trolls are interesting because they originated in northern Scotland, in the folklore of the Shetland and Orkney Islands. In these islands, local folklore was influenced by Celtic and Scandinavian elements. There were historical Viking settlements there. And from the mixing of folklores were born these trolls that are often described as a type of fairy or goblin. Rather than Norse dark elves, they were inspired by trolls, which we will discuss in a moment. Because depending on the traditions in Scandinavia, trolls could range from gigantic to very small. So trolls, it is believed their name comes from troll, are sometimes mean or mischievous, they are to be avoided, and they like hoarding treasures. They don't have traits like the beards, the mining, or the sense of honor of fantasy dwarfs, so they are farther from them than their Germanic counterparts. The 19th century is the time when folkloric tales, or stories drawing inspiration from European legends, are rewritten as fairy tales. And in fairy tales, dwarf figures appear here and there. Actually, it began before the 19th century. In the late 17th century, in France, there was a tale by a noble woman, the Countess of Aulnoy. She is one of the founders of the fairy tale genre. She coined the term conte de fées in 1697 as the title of a collection of tales she had written. And this term, conte de fées, was translated literally to fairy tales. So she wrote a tale about a yellow dwarf, a small trickster that rides a cat and lives in an orange tree. This dwarf is more of a trickster than a mean character. It draws on these folklore dwarfs of the medieval and early modern periods. Later, in the 19th century, dwarves multiply in fairy tales. The most famous example is Snow White, obviously, where the 7 dwarfs are benevolent miners. But dwarves were not always that nice. In other tales that have been a little forgotten by the Brothers Grimm too, like Snow White, dwarves appear as grumpy, bearded, and always tied to forests or earth or treasures. Continuing the Germanic tradition. For example, there is a tale called Schneeweißchen und Rosenrot, Snow White and Rose Red. So Snow White and Rose Red in this story are sisters, 2 kind sisters who repeatedly encounter a wicked dwarf, wicked and ungrateful. He gets trapped by his beard, first in a tree, then in the mouth of a fish, and finally under a heavy log. Each time the 2 girls help him by cutting his beard or freeing him. But instead of thanking them, he complains about the loss of his beard. He is villainous, and since it is a fairy tale, he will end up being punished for that. By the end of the story, he tries to steal a treasure from a bear that is actually not a bear, but an enchanted prince. The bear kills him, and this breaks the curse that made him a bear. He becomes a handsome prince again. So in that story, the dwarf is the bad guy, and he appears greedy, ill-tempered, which are negative personality traits that had been associated with dwarfs for a long time. There are other examples of dwarves in books by the Brothers Grimm. Sometimes, such as in a story called The 3 Little Men in the Woods, dwarves can be helpful and kind. It really depends on the story and how dwarves are being treated. Dwarves remain ambivalent, but overall they become less fearsome and more relatable in all these 19th century stories. They serve as archetypes for human personality traits or impulses, which humanizes them. And even though when Tolkien imagined his dwarves, he looked back to Germanic mythology, some of this stayed. The dwarves are not aloof or aristocratic beings like the elves. The elves may be admirable with their high standard of physical perfection and their immortality, but they set the bar very high. The dwarves are more relatable as short, bearded warriors and miners. They like to have fun, to eat, to be entertained. They have human qualities and flaws. Tolkien also invented things, giving them a creation myth, turning them into an exiled race that hangs to the remains of a past that was more glorious. And he emphasized their conflicts with elves or orcs, things that did not particularly exist before. Probably even more than for elves, his template was very influential because it has barely changed after him. I just mentioned orcs, so let's talk about them, but together with goblins and trolls, because however different they are pictured, these three have historical connections. The most recent ones are actually the orcs, that are a modern invention by Tolkien. They are not traceable to a particular legendary template. The typical fantasy orc is, or at least used to be, a brutish monster, with a green, grey or dark skin, small eyes, prominent teeth, and a savage appearance. They are strong, aggressive. They live in clans or hordes led by warlords, and their culture is centered on survival and warfare. They used to be very bad, the archetypal brutish antagonist. This is what they are in The Lord of the Rings. Maybe this has changed a bit, because in some media, like World of Warcraft or the Elder Scrolls, they have been humanized. They are still savage, but they can be more noble. They have a code of honor, and they form families with traditions, moral complexity. They are sometimes pictured as misunderstood by other races. So they are no longer only cannon fodder that heroes need to get rid of. But still, orcs are a modern invention. They start with Tolkien, and they have no direct equivalent in folklore. The name orc was chosen by Tolkien for its simplicity, and because it expressed a certain brutality. It existed before. It appeared in Werewolf, the medieval Anglo-Saxon epic, in which it names unprecise monsters, hellish creatures. It seems the word orc was borrowed from Latin orcus. Orcus was a rather ancient god of the underworld that may have appeared in the Etruscan religion in central Italy. From the Etruscans, it passed to the Romans, that conflated Orcus with Pluto, the Roman equivalent to the Greek Hades, the master of the underworld, where the spirits of dead people were believed to go after death. The term orco survived in Italian. It refers to a kind of monster found in fairy tales that feed on human flesh. And this word, orco, may have passed to French as ogre, and from French to English as ogre, which are a different type of creatures than orcs. But both words may be distant cousins. they would come from this same Latin origin. Maybe the closeness of ogre, which was already a well-known word for monsters, and orc also explains why Tolkien chose this name for his monstrous creatures. Even though they were new when Tolkien published his books and stories, they still had a sense of familiarity to readers, because there was a long tradition in Europe of savage humanoid monsters of different sizes and different characters, since at least the Middle Ages. Ogres, trolls, goblins. Orcs are fairly different from them, because they form warfaring tribes, and no creature had been described like them before. But to the average reader, they were at the same time reminiscent of these monsters. After Tolkien, contrary to dwarves, for example, that remained very close to his template, orcs have kept evolving. They were embraced by Dungeons and Dragons in the 1970s, and then franchises like Warhammer or Warcraft that made the green skin familiar, and also maybe a more cartoonish appearance for orcs, with huge tusks and a very muscular build. So orcs are physically strong, and that's a big difference with our next creatures, goblins. In modern fantasy, goblins are also antagonists, but they are more like low-tier antagonists, and sometimes even they serve as a comic relief kind of phrase. This depiction of goblins is posterior to Tolkien. In his works, goblins and orcs are not differentiated. Actually, in The Hobbit, which was written before The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien calls goblins the creatures that will become orcs later. The modern goblin, as a small being, also often green-skinned, is an invention of Dungeons and Dragons, where goblins are typically relatively weak enemies, starter enemies. They compensate with numbers, but they tend to be disposable. Different franchises since the 1980s have added things, a bit of complexity, making them counterparts to the stronger orcs, introducing varieties like night goblins or forest goblins in Warhammer, making them small engineers sometimes. And in more recent fantasy books, they also gained more relatable traits, moving away from pure villainy. Now this term, goblin, has deeper roots in European folklore. We are back to it. It is believed their names come from medieval Latin, goblinus, or Greek, kobalos, meaning rogue or mischievous. This Greek root could have given kobold in German, which were small household or mining spirits that were seen in a rather good light in the early Middle Ages, as helpful spirits that would live in homes and help people at night, doing chores and domestic work against a bit of food. With Christianization, they were increasingly seen as malicious, a pagan type of belief, and they started to gain a bad reputation. So the Latin goblinus passed to Old French, Goblin. It is attested around the 12th century, and from Old French to Old English as goblin around the 14th century. Depending on the regions in Western Europe, goblins, gobelins or kobolds were not a single unified concept, but rather a term for small supernatural beings. The small size was systematic, around 1 or 2 feet in height, and they were imagined with furry or leathery skin and abilities such as invisibility or shape-shifting. As time passed in the Middle Ages, they became increasingly villainous. At best, they would move objects or tangle hair when people slept. At worst, they would cause nightmares, make travelers lose their way, or steal children. They ended up often being conflated with these medieval fairies that we talked about before, so they were not likable at all. Now you may have heard the term hobgoblin. In Dungeons and Dragons, hobgoblins are like super goblins. They are still small, but bigger than goblins, and stronger or more intelligent. The term hobgoblin also has a history in English folklore. A hob or a hobgoblin, after the two words were associated, was an archetype of these household spirits. The word hobgoblin is first attested in writing in 1530, but it is believed it was already in use before. So a hob in the English Midlands and Northern England was a folkloric household spirit. Like kobolds and goblins, they were initially rather helpful creatures, but increasingly seen as malicious. They had cousins in Scotland, the Brownies, hairy little men also found in human dwellings and doing jobs around the house when their humans were asleep. The Scottish Brownies were generally seen as nicer. They could play light pranks, but they were peaceful. Like a lot of creatures in folklore, the fact that the stories about them were passed between generations doesn't mean that people completely believed in them. They played with the idea, or they told these stories to kids. So household hobs, brownies, goblins or kobolds were a bit like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy today. A popular myth that everyone knows about, but that is more an element of culture than a real, deep belief. And as the Middle Ages advanced, and then the modern period, the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, Catholic and Protestant churches tended to discourage these beliefs or equate folkloric beings with evil spirits, which probably contributed to the worsening of their reputation. From helpful domestic heads to prankers to completely malicious little devils. They also got a reputation for living not just in homes, but also underground, in caves or in mines, becoming a bit more like dwarves, but not nice dwarves. Modern fantasy revived their memory. It started with Tolkien writing about goblins in The Hobbit, before he switched and called them orcs. But the real starting point for fantasy goblins was in the 1970s, especially with Dungeons and Dragons, exploiting the old medieval traditions about them, sneaky, small, individually rather weak, a bit sinister, but not that dangerous neither individually. And adding to it the tribal dimension. Fantasy goblins are usually found in large groups, or they are like a weaker and smaller version of orcs that sometimes they accompany and serve. So fantasy goblins are small, orcs are human-sized or a bit bigger than humans, but there are bigger monsters in modern fantasy, especially the trolls. This is yet another type of monster that fantasy fans are familiar with. Trolls are massive, way higher than a human being. They look towering. They are brutal, heavily muscled, with thick skin, leathery or stony skin, in various shades of grey, green, or brown. Fantasy authors like to have different kinds of trolls, adapted to different environments: forest, mountains, swamps. They often have features like long arms, a bit like gorillas, oversized noses or fangs, or tusks. They seem to be prone to mutation, with various heads or more than 2 arms. So they can vary in size and appearance, but the stereotype includes ferocity, towering size, something apish in their aggressiveness. They are voracious, they eat anything. And also they are quite dumb, more stupid and less civilized than orcs and goblins. Other frequent characteristics are that they are vulnerable to sunlight and fire, and that they regenerate. They heal very quickly, except if you attack them with fire. Fantasy trolls are also a modern recreation, but contrary to orcs that are a recent invention, and goblins that descend from medieval fairies and household spirits, trolls have clear roots in mythology, in Norse myth. The word troll comes from the Old Norse language, in which it could name different supernatural beings: giant, monster, magical being, or demon. This plurality of meanings explains that under the same name, very different creatures passed from mythology to Scandinavian folklore. Physically, trolls could be seen as small or sometimes human-sized, in which case they were like a local version of fairies, little hidden creatures, not always entirely malicious, but always dangerous, because they were unpredictable and devoid of human morality. I told you in a previous story about the myth of changelings. In Scandinavia, trolls were made responsible for these alleged substitutions of children and their replacement with fake humans. In this case, they were an alternative to fairies. In other regions of Scandinavia, trolls could be bigger or even gigantic. In particular in Norway, where local legends attribute rock formations to trolls. There would be petrified trolls that were surprised by sunlight and turned to stone. There are several places in Norway that bear names coming from this local folklore, such as Trollstigen, the Troll Path or Troll Trail, a mountain pass, or Trolltunga, Troll's Tongue, an overhanging rock formation in southern Norway. Legend says it was a troll's tongue mocking the sun before turning to stone. There is even Trollheimen, home of the trolls, which is a mountainous region in central Norway, known for its spectacular peaks, and there are more. So, folkloric Scandinavian trolls would come in various shapes and styles. What unified them was that they were symbols of wilderness, untamed nature, and its destructive forces, not a welcoming, nurturing vision of nature, but rather a harsh and dangerous one. Like elves and dwarves, these personifications of natural forces or concepts were progressively associated with pagan forces and demonized after Christianization. Trolls remained well known across Sweden, Norway or Iceland well after the medieval period. And in Scandinavian fairy tales of the 19th century, they could serve as antagonists, more or less threatening. An example from Norway is Askeladden, a cycle of folk tales. Askeladden means ash boy or ash lad, and these tales are an equivalent in Norway of what the Brothers Grimm did in Germany, gathering oral traditions, a rich body of folklore and stories from rural parts of the country that are the base of a series of tales. In these stories, this ash lad is the youngest of 3 brothers in a poor farming family, and he is the classic underdog. He is dismissed as weak or simple by his family and others. He is called Ash Boy for sitting by the fireplace instead of doing useful work. Of course, the stories reveal that he is worth way more than others think, and thanks to his wit, his kindness, and a bit of luck or magic, he succeeds in various adventures. A lot happens to him, including encounters with trolls. In one of them, a hungry troll challenges him to an eating contest. The troll can obviously eat huge amounts, but the boys cannot. Yet Askeladden triumphs with a trick. He cuts a hole in a bag and pretends to eat while the food just falls through the bag, and the troll tries to match him to the point that it bursts from overeating. And so the boy keeps the treasure previously owned by the troll. In another story, he is sent to steal magical treasures from another troll. Treasures like magic silver ducks that can swim on land, or a golden harp that plays itself. With various tricks and great courage, he succeeds again. So by the 20th century, when all these modern fantasy figures took shape, trolls were a logical source of inspiration, and one that, once again, Tolkien exploited. But sparingly. There are trolls in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but not many. He kept the sunlight weakness of Scandinavian folklore and chose to make his trolls rather big. In that sense, he was once again a big influence, because the term troll in fantasy could have ended up being applied to small creatures if another Scandinavian tradition had been picked. The concept of regenerating troll appeared in the 1960s in fantasy literature, and it was popularized by Dungeons and Dragons from the 70s. Dungeons and Dragons also introduced this variety of trolls from forests, mountains, or swamps, and turned them into typical high-tier threats or monsters. They became formidable opponents, in particular due to their regenerative powers. You already know different things about our first creature, the phoenix, a legendary, immortal bird that can regenerate. It has often been depicted as able to be reborn from its own ashes. More than a creature associated with one specific culture, the phoenix is a motif, a figure that appears across different cultures and periods of time. We're going to see how it existed under different names and appearances, from ancient Greece and Egypt to China, Persia, the Arab world, also in Slavic mythology and medieval folklore. And this journey begins with the name itself, phoenix. This word has traveled. Phoenix entered the English language from Latin. It passed to Old English. But this Latin word came from Greek, phoenix. It was attested in ancient Greek, the Mycenaean Greek language, in the 2nd millennium BC. But it seems the Greeks borrowed this word from the Levant, from the name of a red dye. Phoenix probably came from the same word that gave the word Phoenicia and the Phoenicians, the name under which we know these people from the Levant. In Greek, Phoenician means those who work with red dyes. So to the ancient Greeks, phoenix might also have meant the red or the purple bird, or the Phoenician bird. And from there, the word passed to Latin, and centuries later to Old English or Old French. The phoenix we know of nowadays as a bird that can be reborn from its ashes comes from the Greek tradition, but it was very long in the making. From the Mycenaean period, which was in the 2nd millennium BC, we don't have more about the phoenix than this mention of the word. No text or story about it, no description. The earliest clear mention of the phoenix as a legendary bird that we know of is from the 8th century BC, in a text attributed to Hesiod, a Greek poet, a contemporary of Homer. Hesiod is maybe lesser known than Homer. You know that Homer is credited with foundational works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but his identity is still debated. The majority of scholars believe that the Iliad and the Odyssey probably had different authors. So Homer may be a legendary figure, or an author to which more works would have been attributed. Hesiod's existence and body of work is way better documented. There is no doubt that he was a real person, and he left several works that are known in their entirety, epic poems such as the Theogony, that tells the origins and lineages of Greek gods, or Works and Days, a poem that includes a well-known myth such as Pandora and Pandora's box. He most certainly put in writing myths that had been in circulation for generations before him. He did not invent them. But he is a major source on Greek myth. So in another of his works, called Precepts of Chiron, which has been partially lost, we only have fragments of it, he wrote about the phoenix. Chiron was a centaur, a half-man, half-horse creature. Contrary to his kind, he was cultured and wise. In a fragment of Precepts of Chiron, he speaks about the lifespans of different creatures. He says that a crow lives for as long as 9 men, and a stag's life is 4 times a crow's, while a raven's life is 3 times a stag's. And finally, the phoenix outlives 9 ravens. So if you do the math, the phoenix lifetime is almost 1,000 times the length of a human's life. 972 human lives, precisely. Tens of thousands of years. Based on what we know, no description of the phoenix is provided. And after that text, from the 8th century BC, the phoenix remains elusive in archaic Greece. It is not depicted or present in any classical myth of Greece. But as a legendary bird, it is known. We know that from another account from the 5th century BC, an account left by Herodotus, the Greek historian. Herodotus is regarded as one of the first historians, if not the first, because he would look for primary sources and check information or discuss the credibility of sources. He distanced himself from sources instead of just affirming things without saying where they came from and deliberately mixing facts and fiction. That's in theory, because in practice he still told a lot of legends as if they were true. And he wrote an account of the phoenix, presented as an Egyptian bird, a sacred bird. He writes that according to Egyptian texts and conversations he had had in Egypt, the phoenix was extremely rare. There would have been only one in existence at any time. And once in 500 years, when the old phoenix dies, a new one appears. He did not invent that. The Egyptians from the city of Heliopolis venerated a legendary solar bird called the Bennu, and this cult was very ancient. This bird, the Bennu, is first mentioned in the pyramid texts, which date to the Old Kingdom, 2,000 years before classical Greece. This Bennu would have been a symbol of the creator god Atum. How the Egyptians of this period, of the Old Kingdom, imagined the Bennu is uncertain. But 1,000 years later, in the New Kingdom, the Bennu started to be pictured as a grey heron, carrying a solar disk. The Bennu of the New Kingdom appears on amulets shaped as scarabs, amulets that are placed with the bodies of the dead. So it is believed to have been a symbol of rebirth. This Egyptian bird may have inspired the Greek phoenix via accounts left by Herodotus. What is unclear is to what extent he imagined things or repeated information given to him by Egyptians of the 5th century BC. In any case, this depiction by Herodotus of the phoenix as a big bird, looking like a red eagle and associated with the sun, stayed. The other themes associated with the phoenix in ancient Greece were added after Herodotus by other authors, like the theme of the fire or the bird turning to ashes and being reborn from these ashes. In the earliest known images of the phoenix produced by the Greeks, it is associated with the sun. We know it because it features 7 rays of light around it. Like traditionally the personification of the sun, Helios, was depicted. In the centuries after Herodotus, both in Greece and the Roman world, other authors write about the phoenix, and all keep its ability to be reborn from its ashes. But they add details, like different sizes. Herodotus talked of it as the size of an eagle, but a few centuries later it has grown to the size of an ostrich. Its colors also change. From red and yellow, it becomes covered in gold feathers or scales on its legs. Its eyes are either yellow or blue like sapphires, depending on the authors. And its life cycle varies greatly, from 500 years to 1500 years, to even immortal, since it can reappear from its ashes forever. Even though the phoenix is not a figure that appears much in Greek and Roman myth, it is apparently appealing enough to survive antiquity. It remains known as a symbol of rebirth that is occasionally painted. There is no specific canon to it, but the themes of flames and an appearance of eagle or bird of prey, and almost always the phoenix depicted as being reborn from fire, these keep coming back all the way to medieval art. The phoenix as a symbol was known enough for it to be referenced often in European heraldry. That is to say, the design of armorial bearings, coats of arms. European heraldry developed in particular in the High Middle Ages, the period from the 11th to the 14th centuries, before the Late Middle Ages. Every noble house had to have its coat of arms. They represented typically towers, plants, weapons, and animals, real or legendary. These symbols could appear as charges, that is to say as emblems, typically on a shield, or as crests, the device placed on top of a helm. Phoenixes occasionally appeared as charges, but more often as helm-top ornaments, as crests. Of course, the animals chosen in heraldry were seen as symbols of power, of nobility. People wanted lions, dragons, or eagles, not rodents or bugs. And this, the appearance of the phoenix in heraldry, tells us that the phoenix in medieval times is a well-recognized symbol, not a very prominent one, but people identify it. And as a symbol of rebirth, by extension of resilience, it becomes one of the numerous emblems used by aristocrats all the way up to royalty. For example, Queen Elizabeth I used the phoenix as one of her emblems. So this is the cultural legacy that lives on today, in reference to the phoenix. In X-Men or Harry Potter or fantasy literature, phoenix is a word that carries on these meanings: legend, fabulous bird, the power of resurrection, or renewal, triumph of life over death, or the cyclical nature of life and history. But I also told you at the beginning that the phoenix was a motif. There are analogues to it in a variety of cultures, which speaks of an appeal of these concepts for humans. So what are some of its analogues? First, there is a Persian legendary bird, the simurgh, a benevolent, wise, and giant bird that will live for centuries. And in at least one legend, the simurgh plunges into flames at the end of its life to be reborn from them. The simurgh can be found often in Persian art and literature. Its iconography also expanded to regions that were in contact with Persian culture, like the Eastern Roman Empire. In art, it is often depicted as really gigantic, strong enough to carry off an elephant or a whale. And it is primarily a bird, but a composite bird, with the head of a dog and lion claws. The theme of rebirth from ashes is not prominent around the simurgh, but what is an extremely long life, like the antique phoenix. It is said to be so old that it has seen the destruction of the world 3 times over. Another example of phoenix-like bird is the anka, an ancient fabulous bird from Arab mythology, pre-Islamic mythology. It dates back from antiquity. The anka is a female bird said to appear only once in ages, but the rest of the time it would stay where the sun sets. It has been described with 4 wings, a long neck, and as very colorful. Throughout many ages, it would have acquired experience and wisdom that it uses to give moral advice or warnings. According to one medieval author, Zakaria al-Kazwimi, the bird would live for 1700 years, like the Persian simurgh. And the Persian influence is very likely here. And the anka would only mate at 500 years of age, laying a single egg in which the chick stays for 125 years. Near the Persian cultural area, in Turkic mythology, there's also the conrel, another simurgh-like or phoenix-like, very long-lived bird that is cyclically regenerated. To the east, in China, there is the fenghuang, sometimes called the Chinese phoenix. The fenghuang doesn't seem to have a direct cultural connection with the Persian and the Greek phoenix, but they share similarities. the benevolence or positive connotation, or the fact that it appears in some traditions to mark the beginning of a new era. Implicitly, there's the concept of cycle. In other Chinese traditions, the Fenghuang is said to hide in times of trouble and reappear when good times begin. In ancient China, before the first millennium BC, the Fenghuang originally consisted of a separate male bird, Feng, and a female bird, Huang. Together they were depicted as a symbol of harmony between the yin and yang aspects, or a symbol of love between husband and wife. But starting in the imperial period, 22 centuries ago, the male and female birds merged to form the Fenghuang, and the resulting creature was feminized, becoming a counterpart to the dragon, which used to be a symbol of masculinity. So, since then, Fenghuang and dragon have been depicted in decoration for weddings or in royal symbols, a common yin and yang metaphor and an emblem of relations between husband and wife. Arguably, the Fenghuang is not strictly identical to the phoenix. There is no reference to a rebirth, and it is not specifically a symbol of eternity. There is no direct association with fire or the sun, neither. But the fact that it will return cyclically, announce a renewal, the iconography as a sumptuous and colorful bird, or its very positive connotation, these are all elements that connect it to the Western and Middle Oriental phoenix. Yet another analogue is the firebird from Slavic mythology, a glowing or burning bird often depicted as resembling a falcon from a faraway land that is a bearer of blessings. It may also bring doom to anyone who captures it. Firebirds appear in various Slavic tales, typically as the object of a quest. Here again, the death and rebirth narrative is absent, but firebirds speak of blessings and renewals, and they are described as very similar to the ancient Greek phoenix, with glowing yellow and red colors and an affinity with fire. So all these examples, Egyptian, Greek, Persian, Arab, Chinese or Slavic, they raise the question of why the appearance of this symbol across different cultures. A first type of explanation may just be cultural diffusion. Like goods or languages, symbols traveled, and cultures of Asia, Europe and Africa had contacts in antiquity. The Greek phoenix drew inspiration from Egypt. The Persian simurgh also influenced other legendary birds, and it could have been influenced itself by India. I did not mention it because it seems too far from the phoenix. But India has Garuda, a divine bird in Hinduism. And the Chinese Fenghuang also traveled. It is well known in Korea and Japan. A deity or a legendary creature does not really travel as is. But what can travel is the idea behind it, that may be adopted and modified by each culture, and a given type of narrative or symbol may be adopted by different cultures because they are spontaneously appealing. They are manifestations of the human experience of life and shared psyche in front of universal challenges: the need to survive, the fear or the love of nature, the experience of sleep and dreams, the sex drive, the prospect of death. Beyond cultures, these are universal preoccupations that derive from our human condition, the experience of life. And this is a second possible explanation to a motif like the phoenix. At its core, the figure of the phoenix is the association of a bird with cyclicality, renewal or rebirth, to which elements like the sun or fire are often added. It is rather logical to associate the sun with cycles. The sun goes through a daily death at dusk and a rebirth at dawn. Its position and its warmth also form yearly cycles, while birds living in the sky because they can fly are logical symbols as sky messengers or animals connected to the heavens. Associating them with the sun, and by extension fire, could have stemmed from this. Maybe another dimension of this cultural appeal of the phoenix on a more psychological level is the theory or the observation developed by scholars like Carl Jung or anthropologists like Claude Lévi-Strauss, that similar myths would emerge independently across cultures because humans would structure stories around binaries like life and death or chaos and order. Faced with these oppositions and a human desire for hope and resilience, we would create stories and assemble symbols such as the phoenix, a figure that seems to express the possibility of overcoming mortality, or taking new beginnings, or ordering the world with a cyclical structure to make it readable. This is inherently hard to prove, and the risk of rambling is real when assembling concepts like this at a very theoretical level. But still, if some myths stick around and seem to repeat across cultures when others don't, it is probably because they echo something in our psyche that makes them desirable, resonant. A third group of reasons behind the legend of the phoenix could also be more observation-based. For example, birds may also be good symbols of rebirth just because they lay eggs, as opposed to mammals. Birds are not the only ones to lay eggs, but seeing bird eggs was a very common experience. The egg that gives birth to a new similar bird when it hatches. This works better as a symbol of cycles than the invisible growth of mammals in a womb. The fact that some birds migrate and come back periodically, this is another cyclical feature. And birds are among the most colorful families of animals. So all of these different factors, and the fact that they could work together, are the best explanations we have of this enduring myth of the phoenix. speaking of psychology, culture, and its diffusion, let's move on to a second legendary animal, another famous one, the unicorn. The word makes us picture immediately a horse with a horn. And this is a version of the unicorn that dates back from the European Middle Ages. Since then, the unicorn has not evolved much. But this medieval unicorn is itself the product of a history, one that started in the Bronze Age. The earliest depictions of what could look like an unicorn date back from the 3rd millennium BC, and they were found in the Indus Valley, what is now Pakistan and India. In ruins of the Indus Valley civilization, ancient stone seals, engraved seals, were found, showing what looks like bovine animals with a single horn. These seals are believed to have been symbols of power or emblems of a clan or of a city. It is also unclear whether the horn is actually a horn or if there were two, because these animals are depicted in profile, and we don't know anything else about them. In any case, after the decline of the Indus Valley civilization, they disappear, and it seems later myths about unicorns developed independently. At least they vanished from South Asian art in the 2nd millennium BC. Leaving aside the Indus Valley, the first text describing something resembling an unicorn appeared in Greece in the 1st millennium BC, and it seems they were inspired by rumors or second-hand tales of real animals, especially the Indian rhinoceros. You know that there are different species of rhinoceros. In Africa there are two, the white and black rhino. The white species is the largest, heaviest one. Big adults can weigh more than 3 tons. Black rhinos are smaller, more compact and also more agile. These African species have 2 horns on their nose, whereas the Indian rhino has only 1. They all have thick skin, but African species have relatively smooth skin, whereas the Indian species has bumps and folds that give it like a more prehistoric, armored look. The population of Indian rhinoceros had declined a lot and was considered endangered at the beginning of the 20th century. Only a few dozens remained. But thanks to conservation efforts, their numbers have increased again, especially in the past 20 years. There are a few thousands of them now, living in protected parks in reserves. Tales of Indian rhinoceros probably traveled westward to the Mediterranean, and when they arrived in Greece, of course the description had changed. In the writings of a Greek physician and historian of around 400 BC, Ctesias, the animal was still large, but now agile and fast, with still this distinctive horn. Ctesias did not use the term unicorn to name this creature, but he left a description that later writers would build upon. Authors like Pliny the Elder, a Roman author, scientist and army commander. Elaborating on the description by Ctesias, he came up with a creature called monokeros, or monoceros, one horn in Greek. It was a composite beast that would have had the head of a stag, with the feet of an elephant, a horse-like body, and a single black horn on its head. This monokeros was not shy, elegant, or wondrous, like unicorns would be imagined later. Instead, Pliny emphasized its ferocity. It was a dangerous beast from exotic lands. This animal entered what is called bestiaries. What is this? Bestiaries, from Latin bestiarium, meaning collection of beasts, were illustrated books, compendiums, that described real and mythical animals. The tradition dates back from antiquity. Their ancestor is a Greek text called the Physiologus, which means the naturalist. An anonymous text compiled sometime between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, so in the late antiquity. It contains chapters, each dedicated to a different animal, with a biblical quotation, a description of the creature, and comments about its nature, real or fabulous, imaginary. And there's also a moral or religious allegory about it. The Physiologus was very influential. It was translated to multiple languages during the Middle Ages, and it was one of the most read books after the Bible at the time. What it had done was compile and Christianize older descriptions of animals, such as the ones left by Pliny the Elder. Building on the example of this text, medieval bestiaries appeared by the 10th and 11th centuries, and they were very successful. They circulated widely, especially in England and in France in the 12th and 13th centuries. We know it from the hundreds of copies, now more than 800 years old, that survived to this day. These medieval bestiaries that were copied manually, like all books at the time, were illustrated and a bit more encyclopedic than the Physiologus, in the sense that on top of the drawings they tried to explain a little about the animals. For real but exotic animals, the information was widely inaccurate, and they did not distinguish facts from fiction, so there was none of the search for veracity that drive encyclopedic projects. But still, they provided a window on the natural and imaginary worlds that fascinated people. In the Physiologus and these medieval bestiaries, animals were always allegorized. They became symbols of strength, courage, cowardice, ingenuity, purity or betrayal, including this monokeros described by Pliny the Elder and other antique authors. From a quite frightening and ferocious composite beast, rather monster-like, the monokeros underwent a drastic transformation in medieval bestiaries. First, its name changed from a Greek to a Latin root. It became unicorn in Old French from Latin unicornus, an adjective turned into a noun, one horn, which Old English borrowed as unicorn. And the symbolism attached to the animal became one of purity and love. In bestiaries and popular culture, the legend that spread around unicorns was that only a virtuous virgin could approach and tame one. The unicorn would willingly lay its head in a maiden's lap, and no one else. If you see medieval and early modern depictions of unicorns and women, it always is a nod to this legend. Bestiaries were infused with Christian allegories too, and the unicorn became an allegory for the Incarnation, God choosing and entering the Virgin Mary's womb. The description of the unicorn changed accordingly. The distinctive horn stayed, but the monstrous composition of body parts from different animals disappeared, to be replaced with the body of a white horse, sometimes a white goat in early descriptions, and also sometimes a beard or a lion's tail. But any signs of ferociousness were erased, to be replaced with graceful traits, and the color white, suggesting purity. By the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, this version of the unicorn explodes in art, on paintings, on tapestries, also in heraldry. For example, at the time it becomes the national animal of Scotland by the 15th century. At the time, people also believe that unicorns are real. They have never seen one, but they have never seen elephants or ostriches neither, and very few have seen real lions. So a horse with a horn does not seem so far-fetched. It is credible. In the Middle Ages, as the era of this new reinvented unicorn has already begun, Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler, sees what he believes to be an unicorn during one of his journeys. In reality, it is an Indian rhinoceros, and he is very disappointed by the differences with the graceful creature of medieval folklore. He calls it ugly and muddy because indeed, even though the rhino is probably an inspiration, the idealized unicorn has changed dramatically since the first second-hand descriptions that gave birth to the monoceros. An element that gave credibility to the existence of the unicorn is that so-called unicorn horns circulate at the time. In reality, they are narwhal tusks coming from Arctic seas. The narwhal is a species of whale with teeth. Males of the species have a single spiraled tusk that can be huge, 5 to 10 feet. That's 1.5 to 3 meters. This tusk is thought to serve as a weapon, like elephant tusks, and in courtship displays to attract mates. Narwhals have been hunted for thousands of years by Inuit people around the Arctic Circle for their meat and ivory. Narwhal tusks were always very rare in Europe, but some arrived via Scandinavian traders from narwhals hunted or washed ashore around Greenland. The belief that these unicorn horns had healing properties and could purify poisoned water developed in the Middle Ages, making narwhal tusks very sought after. These spiraled horns influenced the medieval iconography. Unicorns would now be pictured with long, spiraled horns. So the existence of these horns, plus the fact that unicorns were a plausible animal form, looking like cute white horses, all of this made them believable. The realization that unicorns were nowhere to be found in the real world happened in stages between the 17th and 19th centuries. Despite a more and more thorough exploration of the world, no unicorns were found, and the belief in their existence vanished. But they had acquired so much fame in folklore, allegories, and such a positive symbolism that they lingered in folklore and were romanticized even more. Starting in the 19th century, they appeared in fairy tales and became pure fantasy beings, often associated with rainbows in the 20th century, and present in children's literature or toys. So why this enduring figure in art and popular culture? Probably because beyond its aesthetic and fantastical aura, the unicorn has become like an embodiment of the unattainable ideal. The legend makes them literally almost uncatchable, but in a more symbolic sense, it can be purity. We saw that medieval unicorns carried this allegorical meaning, the incarnation, extreme rarity. This ideal can also be the discovery of something extremely rare. They seem close because they are plausible animals, but they remain very elusive. Actually, an unicorn can be a metaphor for an object, a solution or person that perfectly matches a search, even in a very mundane context. Nowadays, for example, in business, an unicorn is a startup that is already valued at $1 billion or more. The word is increasingly used as a metaphor for very rare, difficult, but not impossible things. The unicorn is this extraordinary thing, event or discovery, that lurks just beyond the ordinary, a promise of wonder and perfection. I promised you we would also talk about mermaids, so let's do it. This is another class of creatures that has undergone a lot of transformation, and also one that exists under one form or another on all continents. The figure of the mermaid tells us of different things too, like the dangers of nature and seafaring, or the evolution of ideas around femininity and temptation. The typical mermaid is a being with the upper body of a woman and the lower body of a fish. And this concept of fish-tailed human figures first appeared, as far as we know, in Babylonian art, in ancient Mesopotamia. So they appear almost 4,000 years ago, on seals and later in sculptures. These creatures seem to have been protective spirits of both sexes, called Kuliltu, fishwoman, and Kukulu, fishman. Around 1000 BC appear depictions of an Assyrian goddess. The Assyrians are the Mesopotamians of the north, what is today northern Iraq and the east of Syria. So an Assyrian goddess called Atargatis, sometimes depicted as a half-woman, half-fish entity. We don't know much about this deity at the time she was worshipped only by the Assyrians. They were not a seafaring culture, and they represented her as anthropomorphic, without a fishtail. But later, during the Greek period, in the 3rd century BC, after the invasion of Alexander the Great, her cult spread to various parts of the Greek world, carried by Greek merchants or mercenaries. She was generally regarded as a form of Aphrodite and associated with fertility. This is when her fishtail appeared. We also have a later legend about her. According to Roman writings of the 1st century BC, she would have been a goddess of fertility who had fallen in love with a shepherd, a mortal. They had a daughter together, but this love was illicit and degrading for a goddess. So in shame, she flung herself into a lake, and her body was changed into the form of a fish. Only her head or her upper body remained human. This makes her the first archetype of mermaid with a backstory. If we leave aside these Mesopotamian seals and sculptures with fish women and men that we don't know much more about. The story of Atargatis appeared in the Greco-Roman world when an already well-known figure was that of the sirens. You know the sirens that appear in the Odyssey and pose a mortal threat to Odysseus, Ulysses, and his crew. These sirens were conceived as large birds with a human head. In the Odyssey, they are said to attract ships with their singing voices. Sailors would be charmed by their songs, lose control, and sail to their island, where their ship would be wrecked, and the sirens would devour them. Odysseus survives this episode by clogging the ears of his crew with wax and asking them to chain him to the mast of the ship. So the sirens of the early or archaic Greek period were monsters, but rather than violence, they used seduction, a kind of spell, on their victims. Their depiction in the Odyssey did not change as antiquity advanced. But during the classical period, the 5th, 4th centuries BC, they were sometimes depicted in art as part fish instead of part bird. The real transformation into half-fish, half-woman creature happened in the medieval period, creating the Western mermaid. It retained the other characteristics of the mythological sirens, the beautiful song to lure sailors, the threat, so they were still dangerous monsters, but instead of just a woman's head, their entire upper body became human, and the bottom part turned into a fish tail. This made them more physically appealing. A mermaid swimming could now look like a woman, reinforcing their seductive power. Where did this transformation appear and how? In these bestiaries I told you about when we spoke of the unicorn, the first descriptions of sirens as sea women appear in the 7th and 8th centuries AD, and by the High Middle Ages this figure of the siren has completely morphed into the mermaid. The word mermaid in English has its first attestation by the late 14th century. It is a compound word in Middle English, formed from mer, sea, and maid. In Romance languages, Italian, Spanish, French, the old word siren, sirène or sirena, remained in use. During the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, there are different examples of bestiaries in which the sirens are described as half bird, half woman, like in antiquity, but the illustrations don't match the text. The same sirens are drawn, painted with fishtails. So this leaves no doubt that mermaids descend straight from sirens. These now half-women sirens would also be depicted with symbols that did not appear in antiquity. Very often they held a fish in one of their hands. But as the Middle Ages advanced, they more and more held a comb or a mirror instead. These symbols were not random. I told you before that real and legendary animals in bestiaries were attributed moral qualities or vices. The figure of the unicorn was very positive. The mermaid not so much. The comb and the mirror being a luxury item at the time that was rare. These were symbols of vanity. So in the Middle Ages, across Christianity, the sirens, now turned into mermaids, had a double dimension. In coastal regions, especially in sailing communities, they were seen or imagined as shipbreakers, marine monsters hiding behind a seductive appearance. But in parallel, they also became symbols of vanity, of feminine seduction, and its perceived dangers, not just as an actual mortal trap, but a moral one too, a trap for the good Christian man's morality and soul. If we look at it from a distance, mermaids and sirens are just one among many examples of half-human, half-animal hybrids that appear not just in Mediterranean or Mesopotamian mythologies, but worldwide. Centaurs, minotaurs, sphinxes, Egyptian or Hindu gods that are part animal, part human, and also in America, Africa, East Asia. Myth and legends include these hybrids. Why is that? What is the appeal of these figures? Ethnology and psychology provide a range of hypotheses that can help understand that. First, there is probably a cultural dimension to it. For prehistoric communities that lived way closer to nature than we do, the perception that they were part of nature was probably more intense. Hybrid figures to them, such as the ones depicted on cave walls, could be a way to express this fluid connection between humans and nature, especially the animals populating it. It could have been at the same time an observation that large animals were their peers or competitors in nature, and also a way of self-defining, of looking for the frontiers between who or what they were and the animal kingdom. Representing hybrids may also have been the expression of an aspiration, a desire to acquire certain qualities attributed to animals: strength, courage, ferociousness, speed, turning them into pictures being like a spell that would hopefully help transform reality. And some of that may have passed to Egyptian or Greco-Roman myth, especially the use of hybrids as others to define humanity. In a hybrid, one can express fears of regression to the beast within each human being. If you think about the Minotaur or the Greek centaur, that were almost always described as barbaric, with the exception of Chiron. Hybrid creatures could also represent a disharmony, an embarrassing connection between humanity and the animal kingdom, a connection that men should overcome, vanquish, or escape in the case of sirens, to reaffirm cultural values as opposed to the state of nature, and maybe to affirm human exceptionalism, the vision according to which we are not animals, but something entirely different, separate. A more psychological way of looking at it could be to suppose that hybrids may be unconscious allegories or metaphors of human nature. Human nature is something very hard to define. And for ancient cultures, like today, it couldn't be defined in a void. Comparisons, references were needed. Are we animals? Are we spiritual beings with a body? Are we beings of nature or beings of culture? A hybrid may be a way to express this questioning, by integrating opposites into a single figure to better define ourselves. A hybrid typically has a human half that would represent reason, consciousness, culture, whereas the animal part stands for instinct, impulses, a shadowy dimension that is unpredictable and mysterious. So in that logic, the hybrid is a physical manifestation of what we are inside. They defy our mental categories: human versus animal, culture versus nature, control versus instinct. They are based on a mismatch, and maybe as such they would mirror an existential unease, an existential questioning of humans. Medieval mermaids are a good example of that, among others. Even negative traits attributed to them, like vanity, seduction, deception, are things we can understand and relate to as humans. They are at least potentially part of us. Now, in the context of medieval Christianity, the mermaid also echoes the fear of feminine seduction, the call of lust that will get good Christians lost. Let's bear in mind that the authors of Bestiaries, those who illustrate them, as well as the artists, especially the sculptors that create mermaid depictions, are men overwhelmingly. They are writing or shaping figures that are half human, but not their half of humanity. Maybe this makes mermaids even more hybrids. First and foremost, the figure of the mermaid is shaped by men, and many of them, the monks who copy and ornate manuscripts, are not supposed to approach women at all. So there could also well be a layer of fear, desire, defiance, prohibition added to this figure. I emphasized more the formation of this Western medieval mermaid because it provided the template for modern mermaids, the ones that populate fairy tales and have become much more positive figures nowadays. We will get back to that. But legendary half-human, half-fish hybrids are to be found worldwide. From Japan, Korea, and China to the Americas, South Asia, or Africa. For example, across many regions of Africa, there is a mermaid-like water spirit called Mami Wata. The name varies depending on the regions, and so do her characteristics. This figure, Mami Wata, emerged from the introduction of various legendary beings from elsewhere, like depictions of European mermaids or Hindu imagery, adopted and reinvented in many parts of Africa. So, did people in antiquity and the Middle Ages really believe in the existence of sirens or mermaids? They may have had doubts, but occasionally sightings were reported in antiquity. Sightings of sirens or half-fish sea creatures, like tritons or nereids, spirits of the sea, obeying to Poseidon or Neptune. Pliny the Elder, of whom we spoke before, wrote about such sightings in the Atlantic off the coast of Portugal. Until the 18th century, there were claimed sightings. It is just an example among many. But in 1493, sailing in the Caribbean, Christopher Columbus claimed he had spotted 3 mermaids. It seems most of the time these sightings can be explained by animal sightings. Seals, manatees, maybe dolphins. Alleged sightings went on in the 19th and 20th centuries, but they were no longer taken seriously. And indeed, there were various hoaxes with fake mermaid bodies manufactured with fish parts. Several fake mermaids made with monkey and fish parts were made in China and Malaysia in the 16th century, to be brought back to Europe by Dutch merchants as exotic curiosities. So the belief in mermaids as real vanished in the 19th century. And like for other fantasy creatures that had been seen as malevolent or dangerous, a much nicer version appeared in tales in the 19th century. Versions of the mermaid in which they are humanized, morally or psychologically. The best known example would be the fairy tale The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. This tale did a lot to establish this modern version of the mermaid, replacing the old monstrous mermaid in popular culture. The mermaid, in that modern sense, has become a bit like a sea unicorn, uncatchable, invisible, but evoking a world of fantasy and wonder close to our world, and like the unicorn, it has become associated with children literature and stories. There was a time when a werewolf scare spread across Europe, at the same time as the fear of witchcraft. And this is when our story begins, specifically at the end of the 16th century, in Germany, near Cologne. A time of big political and religious troubles. At the time, Germany was at the epicenter of Christian Reformation. Protestants and Catholics, they literally fought for influence, for the right to follow the religious precepts of their choosing, or sometimes to force them on others. Germany was scattered into a multitude of small states, free cities, archbishoprics, principalities. And soon all these political and religious divisions, together with the ambitions of other countries, would plunge it into the 30 Years' War. More than any other period in European history, this was the time of witch hunts. There were panic outbursts because of vampirism. And at the time, to be an outcast or to cause your neighbors to dislike you could be very dangerous. Accusations of heresy, of a pact with the devil, or unnatural practices. This could quickly lead you to trial. And this is what happened to Peter Stump, a wealthy farmer from the electorate of Cologne. The electorate of Cologne was an independent ecclesiastical principality. It consisted of the possessions of the Archbishop of Cologne, who ruled over them like a chief of state. And Peter was a widower with 2 children, and maybe because of jealousy for his wealth, maybe because he was a criminal, maybe because he had converted to Protestantism, and not at the right time, just before a new archbishop tried to reinstate Catholicism in his land, he was accused of being a werewolf. He was swiftly arrested and questioned, meaning that he was tortured, after which he confessed he had practiced black magic since he was a child. He also claimed that the devil had given him a magical belt. When he wore it, he turned into a huge wolf with sharp teeth, mighty paws, and an insatiable appetite for animal and human flesh. He confessed to killing and eating 14 children, including one of his own, 2 women, and countless goats, lambs, and sheep. No magical belt was ever found after his arrest, but his confession and various testimonies were considered sufficient to convict him. Another element that played against him is the fact that a big wolf had been spotted near the village, believed to be the werewolf. And this wolf had had its left forepaw cut off. Peter had an injury to his left hand, and this sealed his fate. He was sentenced to death. His trial was publicized to warn people against letting the devil in, and maybe also against heresy. This kind of trial remained a singular event in Cologne, but they spread to many regions of Germany and northern France at the time, together with witch hunts. Men and women alike could be accused of witchcraft, but many more women were. Alternatively, a smaller group of mainly male individuals were accused of being werewolves and turning into bloodthirsty wolves at night. The fear of the wolf was still very much alive across Europe, because attacks occasionally happened. But when the werewolves scare spread in the 16th and 17th centuries, these wolf attacks had become very rare. Populations of wolves in Western Europe had already declined a lot since the Middle Ages, because forested areas were smaller, and wolves are relatively shy. They avoid humans, and their predation was mainly a problem for herds of cattle. The troubled environment at the time may help understand why these witch and werewolf hunts took place, but not specifically why a scare of humans turning into wolves. To understand it, we need to go back much further in time. Where does this concept of a human with the ability to shapeshift into a wolf comes from? And is it supposed to be voluntary, or a curse, or a disease? The word werewolf comes from Old English werewolf, with were meaning man, and wolf which has become wolf. The same roots gave Werwolf in German. And it seems that when it comes to the werewolf folklore in Western and Northern Europe, a major influence was Germanic paganism. That is to say, the religion, the set of beliefs of Germanic peoples from the Iron Age until their Christianization during the Middle Ages. The transformation of men into wolves, this was a recurring feature of their mythology, and it is believed that this was an aspect of the initiation of the warrior class. Symbolically, the transformation of a man into a wolf reflected the transformation of a teenager into a warrior that finds within an animal spirit and the ferocity necessary to accomplish his destiny. Maybe this form of symbolic transformation is even older and broader among Indo-European peoples. I told you about them in many stories about the antiquity in Europe and the Middle East already. They were peoples who migrated from the east to a large region from the north of India to Western Europe several thousand years ago in several waves. They mixed with the locals and they diverged between them, but they had an influence on the culture of all the regions where they settled, and they retained common features in their languages, or maybe even the organization of their societies. The ancient Persians, Greeks, Romans, the Celts, the Slavs, all have Indo-European origins. This would explain why a similar werewolf folkloric tradition exists in Slavic Europe and in the Balkans, without much influence from Germanic peoples in these regions. But when it comes to Western Europe, Germanic peoples spread way beyond modern Germany to France, Great Britain, Scandinavia, and they shaped the werewolf myth in the West, at least its origin. And this may explain why werewolves became associated with evil during the Middle Ages, when they were in the process of being Christianized. Werewolves were a pagan myth, one that had to be erased by the new religion. Being a werewolf had to be evil because it was synonymous with heresy. So Christianization did not make the myth disappear. It reinterpreted it in Christian terms. Now werewolves were cursed, or individuals dealing with the devil. But even before this, and maybe because of common cultural origins between Indo-European peoples, there were already tales of men changed into wolves in classical antiquity in Greece. Greek authors told the story of King Lycaon of Arcadia. There are various versions to the legend, but they all come back to the story of Lycaon displeasing Zeus, the king of gods. And as punishment, Zeus turned him into a wolf. From this legend comes the term lycanthropy, which is the condition that affects werewolves. A lycanthrope is a werewolf, and it has the same meaning in Greek: lukos, wolf, and anthropos, human. There were other tales of lycanthropy in ancient Greece, other legends. One says that in Arcadia was located in the Peloponnese. It is in the heart of ancient Greece, and I referred to it in the recent story about Heracles. So in Arcadia, there was a particular tribe that chose a man every year, says the legend, to be escorted to a marsh in the area. The man left his clothes behind and swam across the marsh, progressively morphing into a wolf, and then he joined a pack of wolves for 9 years. If he refrained from tasting human flesh for these entire 9 years, he could return to the marsh, swim back, and recover his human form. So lycanthropes as a myth existed in Greek and later Roman antiquity, but they were not particularly well known, and other types of legendary creatures drew a lot more interest. What changed in the Middle Ages is that the belief that werewolves were real became widespread, and not just in folkloric tales that people would tell around the fireplace. Werewolves were mentioned in medieval law codes. An example of this is the law code of King Knut at the beginning of the 11th century. Knut Swainson was a Danish prince. He ascended to the throne of England too, and for a few years he ended up ruling over Denmark, Norway, and England, all around the North Sea. But his heirs died, and 30 years after him, the invasion of England by the Normans completely ended his legacy. Apart from lawmakers, churchmen also discussed werewolves in their works. And when they did so, it seems they were considered a fact, not just a possibility. There were dozens of supposed eyewitnesses, or at least that's what they said, who came forward all across Europe along the centuries to testify they had seen a man changing into a wolf. But this never turned into the kind of scare and witch hunts that happened several centuries later after the Middle Ages. These remained local stories that would appear punctually in some places and were forgotten in a few years, like for vampirism in the same period, if you listen to my other story about the history of vampires. With the progress of Christianization, the beliefs about wolf men from Germanic paganism receded, or at least they could not be expressed freely. The one region where pagan traditions persisted longest was in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. In particular, there were warriors in all Norse sagas that you may have heard of, the berserkers. Literally, berserker meant someone who wears a coat made out of a bear's skin. They are less famous, but there were also warriors in wolf skin, the Ulfrednar. Berserkers and Ulfrednars were subject to fits of frenzy in battle. They could start fighting and howling like wild beasts. These wolf warriors, who became inhabited by what seems to be the spirit of a wolf, were sometimes described as Odin's special warriors. But they were not just mythical figures appearing in Viking poems and sagas. Some of the Viking warriors, when the Vikings went to war in the real world, entered in a state of frenzy in battle, and they wore furs of wolf or bear to indicate that they were berserkers, and that in the heat of the battle they may not be able to tell friend from foe. It is unknown what exactly caused this state of rage. Once it was over, these men would be left weak and needed several days to recover. It could have been a kind of hysteria, a madness that would have been induced by rituals before the fight, like howling like animals, or it could also have been a drug or massive amounts of alcohol. Seeds from a plant that may cause symptoms compatible with the berserker state have been discovered in a Viking tomb in Denmark, but in any case, the berserker's behavior may have inspired legends about werewolves. These warriors did not morph into animals physically, but they seemed to spiritually or mentally turn into wolves, or at least into the kind of ferocious beasts that people believed wolves to be. Given that the Vikings terrified many European regions at the turn of the millennium, this could explain that the fear of the werewolf took form in the Middle Ages. However, the myth of shapeshifters that turned into animals goes well beyond Europe. Instead of wolves, they adapt to local predators. In Africa, there are legends about were-lions and were-panthers and leopards. In Asia, from India to China, were-tigers and were-jaguars in Mesoamerican cultures. So it seems that this concept of humans morphing into predators, or the other way around, appears spontaneously in cultures that are far apart. Maybe it was a way to tame the fear of nature, or to acknowledge and express metaphorically the wild animal part in every human being. Or maybe also to explain murders, possibly serial murders, or rare phenomena like cannibalism. An individual who commits such crimes must be at least partly a beast, because it would be too unsettling to admit that he is part of mankind. Returning to Europe and its werewolves, I told you that the preoccupation with lycanthropy really became big after the Middle Ages, in early modern times, and that it came together with witch hunts, the two being very often associated. Werewolfery was only present in a small fraction of witch trials, so in this sense it was rather marginal in comparison. But there are records of such trials all over Europe, from Switzerland, where the first ones happened, to the Baltic, the Netherlands, Germany, France, everywhere. By the middle of the 17th century, though, this belief in werewolves had disappeared almost, and lycanthropy was no longer taken seriously. It seems that werewolves in the 16th century and early 17th century were like UFOs in the 20th century, in the sense that there were hundreds of people coming forward as witnesses, a lot of literature about it, so it looked too big to not at least be credible. But at the same time, no werewolf was ever captured to be studied or ever transformed in front of a court or scientists. In some of the cases, there was convincing evidence of murder or cannibalism against the accused, but no association with wolves could ever be proven. In other cases, there was evidence against wolves that had attacked people. This was rare, but it happened, but known against the persons accused of being that wolf in that case. After the 17th century, the look on lycanthropy changed in accordance with the times. It was more and more regarded as a superstition and possibly a disorder of the brain that made people become convinced that they could turn into animals. And it is true that there is a rare but documented psychiatric syndrome called clinical lycanthropy, which involves the delusion that the affected person can transform into an animal, or even is an animal. There is also a syndrome called hypertrichosis, which can have various causes and leads to an abnormal amount of hair growth over the body. And yet another condition that may have inspired the werewolf myth could be rabies, which is a viral disease with various symptoms like violent and controlled movements, or even porphyria, which is a group of diseases that affect the skin and the nervous system. Maybe these medical aspects played a role, but none of them is really fully convincing. They don't explain a reversible transformation into an animal, and they are not compatible with the afflicted person having a normal social life the rest of the time. But very much like with vampires, a large set of folk beliefs had been formed and was ready to be claimed, used by literature in the 19th century. Local traditions about werewolves evolved in so many different places that this set of beliefs can be very diverse and sometimes contradictory. For example, the transformation into a wolf may be temporary or permanent, or a bit of both. A cursed individual transforms more and more often until he stays stuck in the animal state. Sometimes the person metamorphoses into a wolf, or they just transfer their spirit into a real animal. Depending on the countries, they were said to have traits in their human form that made it possible to identify werewolves. For example, the meeting of both eyebrows at the bridge of the nose, curved fingernails, or low-set ears. There is a superstition in Russia that werewolves can be recognized by bristles under their tongue. And in other countries, it was believed that one method of identifying them was to cut a bit of skin. Fur would appear within the wound. In modern movies, werewolves are often portrayed as anthropomorph. They do not really become wolves when they transform, but rather a half-human, half-wolf creature that can sometimes walk on 2 feet. This wasn't part of folkloric traditions. People believed in a complete transformation that made them almost indistinguishable from real wolves. One universal trait all over Europe, but it has not really been picked up by literature and film, was that werewolves were believed to eat recently buried corpses. And another deviation from the folklore in modern popular culture is how people become werewolves. Nowadays it will often be because of the bite of a werewolf, or because the state of werewolf is genetic and parents pass it to their offspring. But these are modern interpretations, and they were not part of the various methods for becoming a werewolf. One of the most common was that the transformation happened voluntarily, when people put on a belt made of wolf skin or the entire animal skin. In other cases, the transformation happened when the body was rubbed with the magic ointment elaborated by a witch, or just by drinking rainwater from the footprint of an actual wolf, or, of course, by pledging allegiance to Satan. In Italy, Germany, and France, it was said that someone who slept outdoors when the full moon was shining directly on their face could be turned. This belief that links werewolves to the moon and gives them special strength, or forces them to transform when the moon is full, has also been picked up by Gothic literature and movies. There were also remedies to bring people back and cure a victim of lycanthropy. Some of them were relatively soft. In Schleswig-Holstein, in Germany, a werewolf could be cured just by addressing it 3 times by its Christian name. One Danish belief was that just scolding a werewolf would cure it. Other remedies were more extreme. Exorcism could be a method, and so could various potions. These medicinal potions generally used wolfsbane, also known as aconite. It is a plant native to mountainous regions of the northern hemisphere, and it makes beautiful flowers. Now the problem is that several species of aconites are also very toxic. Since the antiquity, aconite has been used to make poisons, including arrow poisons. So many of the cures advocated by medieval doctors were actually deadly to the patients. In German and English folklores, werewolves were also presented as highly resistant to injuries. But one thing could hurt them: silver. This feature appeared relatively late in the 19th century, but most modern fiction uses it too. So we were now reaching the 18th century, and at the time, old beliefs were under attack from many intellectuals, philosophers, scientists. They were called superstitions, or there were attempts at rationalizing them, finding scientific, medical explanations. But it doesn't mean folklore and old beliefs disappeared, especially in more rural and remote areas. As scholars in Vienna, Berlin, Paris, or London were developing the scientific method and questioning beliefs that had existed for centuries, these same beliefs remained very much a part of the life of most people, and the scare of the supernatural had not disappeared. Attacks by wolves became exceptional in Western Europe. In more densely populated countries like Germany, France, the Netherlands, or England, they were extinct by the 17th, 18th centuries, except in very specific remote regions. But they remained a reality in Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and Russia for much longer because of the geography. There were vast areas of woods with few people. One last scare about wolves in Western Europe was the incident of the Beast of Gévaudan, which happened in France in the 18th century, precisely in the south center of the country, in a very rural region that was scarcely populated and where wolves still lived. People started to report attacks by a terrifying creature, looking like an enormous wolf, but with a long tail and formidable teeth and claws. Over the course of 3 years, dozens of people were attacked and killed, prompting hunting parties and even a royal intervention to end it. Several large wolves were killed, and it was believed several times that this was finally over. But the attacks always resumed shortly after. Survivors and witnesses described an unknown beast. They compared it with a wolf, because this was what they knew. But it didn't really match the description of a wolf, especially the type of claws or the long tail they described. And there were dozens of testimonies, all saying the same thing, and also so many attacks that there is little doubt something really happened. Finally, the attacks stopped, and the mystery remained unresolved. Maybe the attacks were the work of several big wolves, or packs of wolves. Or another possible explanation is that a lion, a tiger, or maybe even a liger, because lions and tigers can reproduce, and their offspring can be huge in size. their interbreeding eliminates a gene that limits the size of the two species. So maybe one of the exotic animals that lived in a private zoo escaped, and the beast found a way to survive in the woods by attacking herds and isolated people. Descriptions don't really match that of a big cat, neither, so the beast of Gévaudan will probably remain a mystery. At the time, and this is revealing of how mentalities has already changed, almost no one commented that there was something supernatural or that evil was acting. 1 or 2 centuries earlier, this would have been the go-to explanation, and a witch hunt would have probably occurred. This is quite telling about the evolution of ideas, the way people of the 18th century now saw the world. At this point, it would have seemed reasonable to expect that werewolves would be forgotten. But they were not. Very much like vampires, ghosts, spirits, and even paganism in general, they went through a revival in the 19th century. This was the moment when European national folklores started to be studied as a part of each country's heritage, and also as a literary object. There was more and more interest in medieval traditions and even pre-Christian times, Old Norse mythology, Germanic paganism. The Celts became very much in fashion, and there was also a taste for the occult. All the Western fantasy literature from the 20th century has its roots in this rediscovery, not just werewolves or vampires. Elves, fairies, dragons, magicians and witches. They have evolved over the past 2 centuries, but they all have their origins as fiction characters in the 19th century folklore studies, and this renewed interest for medieval or even older traditions. And this is how the fiction werewolves came to us. They were alluded to in the works of Bram Stoker, the author of the novel Dracula, but they really entered public consciousness in the 20th century, in the 1930s and 1940s, at a time when people had already had quite a lot of vampire movies, and it felt like a good time to introduce a new type of creature. There was a film from 1935, Werewolf of London, which was the first to introduce a hybrid between man and wolf, an anthropomorphic werewolf, which was a break from the long tradition of werewolves turning into real wolves. The first movie to feature the transformative effect of the full moon was from 1943. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. From then, it became a widespread feature. There were more movies in the 70s and 80s, like An American Werewolf in London. Over time, werewolves have become more and more neutral. They can be malevolent but also heroic, depending on the stories. They really became big in the past 30 years, especially in comic books, anime, novels, movies for teenagers, like the Twilight or Underworld series. Once upon a time, long ago, when there were still emperors in Rome, there was a brave Greek soldier who was a member of the Praetorian Guard, the elite unit of the Imperial Roman army that protected the emperors. Praetorian Guard went on missions for the emperor too, and George, that was his name, was sent to Libya. In Libya, there was a city, Cylene, that was terrorized by a fierce dragon. To prevent the monster from attacking and destroying the city, the people gave it 2 sheep every day. But that was not always enough, and sometimes the dragon also required them to sacrifice humans. The human to be sacrificed was elected by the city's people. At the time George was in Cylene, the king's daughter was chosen to be sacrificed. As no one would accept to take her place, George decided he wouldn't let the princess die, nor the tyranny of the dragon go on in the province. So he confronted the monster, and after a terrible fight, he killed it with his lance. When he returned to the city, the king was so grateful that he offered him treasures for saving his daughter's life. But George was also generous and uninterested in worldly fortune. He gave everything to the poor, and his example amazed and inspired all people from the city, who decided to be baptized and became Christians like George. This is the legend of Saint George and the Dragon, which is also the archetypal story of a hero rescuing a princess from a monster. In Western iconography, Saint George is almost always pictured with a spear and slaying a dragon. By the end of the Middle Ages, everyone in Europe knew about this legend. Its oldest known traces are from a Georgian text from the 11th century. From there, it spread to the Byzantine world, and via the Crusades, it reached the rest of Europe. At first it was told in aristocratic circles as a chivalric, fantastic story, and in the 13th century it was popularized and it became a favorite literary subject. The George who became Saint George lived in the 3rd century. He was an early Christian, and he was a soldier. It seems the legend about him slaying a dragon appeared long after he died. The legend also reflects how dragons are typically portrayed in Western cultures. They are monsters to be tamed or overcome by heroes. They often breathe fire, they are very strong, they can fly, and occasionally they live in caves and keep treasures. Fantasy dragons, including from recent stories, all borrow on these traits. But this is just one aspect of these creatures, because very much like the belief in humans morphing into predators we have explored with werewolves, dragons appear in the folklore of many cultures around the world, in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Europe. Chinese dragons are also rather familiar. They don't really fly, at least they have no wings, but they sort of float in the air, and they resemble more snakes with small legs, but there is more to dragons, so let's just find out where they came from. Serpentine mythical creatures are almost universal around the globe, be it in America, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia. Our ancestors believed in, and sometimes worshipped, dragon-like or at least snake-like monsters. And this universality raises the question of why do they appear spontaneously? One hypothesis is that humans have inherited instinctive fear reactions to snakes, large cats, and even birds of prey from thousands and thousands of generations, when staying away from them was a matter of life or death. It still is in some parts of the world. It has been observed, for example, that the fear of snakes is especially prominent in children, including in areas where snakes are very rare. Growing up in the modern world, many people overcome later the fear of snakes, but they remain a group of animals that is generally disliked. So it is not impossible that dragons appear in nearly all cultures because of an innate fear of snakes and other animals that were predators of humans' primate ancestors. It is true that the earliest pictures of dragons discovered all resemble large snakes, with a few other elements taken from big cats and birds of prey. Another source of inspiration could be the ancient discovery of fossils, and also the knowledge of existing reptiles that would have been exaggerated. If you take into account crocodiles, alligators, iguanas, Komodo dragons, different species of lizards, most ancient civilizations and different cultures were in contact or knew about these species. Fossils could also have been an inspiration. In China, India, or around the ancient Mediterranean world, the remains of ancient species were discovered and people had no explanation for them. For example, there was an extinct species of giraffe that left a lot of fossils in the Mediterranean region, called Samotherium. The skulls can easily make you think of a dragon with two horns. In China, too, fossils of large prehistoric animals are very common, and these remains are often called dragon bones. They are an ingredient in Chinese traditional medicine. Now, the explanation by fossils has its limitations too. For example, Scandinavia has a lot of stories about dragons and sea monsters, but as far as we know, its inhabitants had no knowledge of large fossil bones. So let's take a look at these forms that giant serpents or dragons took in various ancient cultures. We're going to see that the modern fantasy dragon is coming from very far. In Egyptian mythology, there were various giant snakes resembling dragons. One of them was Apep, a serpent that lived in the underworld. According to an ancient Egyptian tradition, the passing of days and nights resulted from an eternal fight between the sun god, Ra, and Apep. The setting of the sun was caused by Ra descending to the underworld to battle the serpent. Earthquakes and thunderstorms were thought to be caused by Apep's roar, and an explanation for solar eclipses during daytime was that Apep had left the underworld to attack Ra. Another giant serpent from Egyptian mythology was Denwen. Its body was made of fire, and he was defeated by a pharaoh. This victory against such a dreadful creature was supposed to affirm the pharaoh's right to rule. The Egyptians also invented a symbol called the Ouroboros, a circle made from a serpent or a dragon swallowing its own tail. It is believed that this emblem represented the cyclical nature of everything, days, years, life. There must have been something appealing about this symbol, because from Egypt it entered Western tradition via Greece. It became associated with magic in ancient Greece, and especially with the practice of alchemy. As such, it stayed an alchemy symbol. It appeared in alchemy treatises as an esoteric emblem amongst others like the sun, the moon, or Mercury. It is unclear whether it came from the Mediterranean world or whether it was reinvented far in the north, but the Ouroboros also appears in Norse mythology as a serpent that grew so large that it could encircle the world and grasp its tail in its teeth. The Egyptian Ouroboros was clearly a serpent, but in the West it evolved into a dragon with wings and legs. In Mesopotamia, too, since the 3rd millennium BC, at least, there were artworks representing giant serpentine monsters. In Babylon, people believed and called for the protection of the Mishusu, which had the body of a snake, the forelegs of a lion, and the hind legs of a bird. Probably independently from these, dragons appeared in China, and this is probably the culture where they have become the most prominent. The origins of the Chinese dragons are vague, but the first depictions can be found thousands of years ago on Neolithic pottery. There is a wealth of legends about dragons in China. They are generally more benevolent than in Western tradition, and they are depicted as noble animals. They were supposed to be the highest ranking creatures in the Chinese animal hierarchy. There's a famous Chinese story about the zodiac. It says that long ago, the first god, the Jade Emperor, wanted to select 12 animals to be his guards. So he sent an immortal being into man's world to announce that the earlier one went through the heavenly gate, the better the rank one would receive. The next day, many animals set off towards the heavenly gate. The first to come near the gate was the rat, but he encountered a river that blocked the path. The rat was unable to cross, but he saw a second animal, the ox, that was also traveling to the gate and about to cross the river. So he jumped into its ear and crossed with the ox, On the other side, he quickly jumped out of the ear and sprinted to the gate, which made him the first animal of the zodiac, followed by the ox. Then came the tiger and the rabbit, and in fifth place was the dragon, which was the best looking, bravest, and more powerful of them all. The Jade Emperor noticed this and was so delighted with the dragon that he offered the following place, the sixth place, to the dragon's son. But the dragon didn't come with his son, and the snake, which was astute and crafty, came forward at this moment and said that the dragon was its adoptive father. So the snake ranked sixth. And then came 6 more animals: horse, goat, monkey, rooster, dog, and pig. Together they are the 12 animals of the Chinese zodiac, and come back for a dedicated year, a longer 12 years cycle. As the history of China advanced, dragons became more and more prestigious. By the late imperial China, they were strongly associated with emperors, and the emperor of China was the only one who had the right to feature dragons on his clothing or personal items. There are literally dozens of legends involving dragons. One of them tells of a man called Dongfu, who loved dragons and could understand them so well that he was able to tame and raise them. He was called to serve the emperor and received the name of Wanlong, the dragon raiser. Another story involving a dragon trainer takes place under the Xia dynasty, the very first dynasty in traditional Chinese historiography that would have ruled 4,000 years ago. In reality, a majority of scholars consider this dynasty to be just mythical rather than real, but so is probably the story with dragons. The emperor had received 2 dragons from the god of heaven, male and female, as a reward for his obedience, but he couldn't train them, so he hired a dragon trainer who happened to be a pupil of Wanlong, the one from the previous story. But one day the female dragon died unexpectedly under his watch. Secretly, the trainer chopped her up and served her cooked meat to the emperor. The emperor liked it so much that he asked the trainer for another identical meal. As he had no way of finding more dragon meat and could not come to terms with killing the male dragon, the trainer had to flee the palace and disappear. One of the most famous stories is about the Dragon King, which is a water and weather god from ancient Chinese religion. But this god has adapted to the evolution of religions in China and remains very well known. He is the one celebrated in dragon boat races. Nowadays, these races of man-powered boats are even an international competition in Hong Kong, but their origin dates back to 2,000 years ago, from the Guangdong province in the south of China. The dragon god, or dragon king, has 4 different aspects that are associated with seas and lakes. As a green dragon, it is the god of the East and the patron of the East China Sea. It can also be a red dragon, that rules in the south and the South China Sea. As a black dragon, it is the ruler of the north and Lake Baikal, which is located in Russia nowadays, or the North China Sea. And finally, as a white dragon, it is the god of the west and resides inside Qinghai Lake, the largest lake in China. Apart from dragon boat racing, another Chinese custom that also revolves around dragons is the dragon dance, which takes place during the Spring Festival, the celebration of the Chinese New Year. People construct a long dragon, typically 16 foot long, from bamboo strips, cloth and paper, which is paraded through the city. The original purpose of this ritual was to worship the dragon god and bring good weather and a good harvest. Nowadays it is done mainly for good luck and entertainment. In Asia, dragons are not limited to China. There are also similar traditions in Korea, Japan, Vietnam. In all these countries, the cultural influence of China is very strong, and their dragons resemble the Chinese ones. In Korea, dragons are often depicted with a longer beard and are generally benevolent. They bring rain, and as in China, they are related to water and agriculture. In Korean folk mythology, dragons begin their lives as emojis, or lesser dragons, which are said to resemble big serpents. In order to become fully fledged dragons, they must survive 1,000 years or overcome a curse that has made them unable to become dragons. In Japan, dragons appear without wings and with 3 claws. They are associated with bodies of water and rainfall. These are just a few examples, but in India too, in Mesoamerica, there were large serpentine creatures, often with wings, legs and claws. So there is little doubt that creatures of a similar appearance tend to pop up in almost every ancient culture. Now let's return to Europe and see how the Western fantasy dragon was born. In Greek mythology, there were multiple dragon-like creatures. We don't know where they come from, but possible origins include Indo-European myth. All Indo-European peoples had myths involving dragons, and the Proto-Greeks were Indo-Europeans. It could also be through contacts with the Near East and Egypt, where mythological dragons also existed. Or maybe the Greeks recreated them, since dragons seem to appear spontaneously. The most fearsome monster in all Greek mythology was probably Typhon. It was a horrible creature with 100 serpent heads that could breathe fire. Zeus confronted it and scorched all its heads with lightning bolts, after which Typhon was exiled to Tartarus, hell for the ancient Greeks. Another large serpent was Python, slayed by god Apollo near the city of Delphi. After freeing the Delphi area from the monster, Apollo set up his shrine there. There was also the Hydra from the swamps of Lerna, slayed by Heracles as one of his labors. In the quest of the Golden Fleece, hero Jason had to slay a dragon too. There are more examples in literature and mythology, but surprisingly also in accounts that were supposed to be real. In the 5th century BC, the Greek writer Herodotus is famous for being the first known historian, in the sense that he wrote about the past after inquiries and research. He did not just write chronicles that glorified kings or repeated legends. But still, he had limited archives, and what he wrote was sometimes far from accurate. In one of his books, he claimed that Libya was inhabited by monstrous serpents. There is no other evidence of this, but if you remember, the legend of Saint George that we talked about at the beginning, that appeared centuries later, was also located in Libya, and maybe there were tales about this already for a long time, repeated or invented by Herodotus. In another book, he states that Arabia was home to winged snakes, with little wings looking like bat wings. In the 2nd century BC, a Greek astronomer named the constellation Draco, the dragon. The word comes from Greek, which indicates that this type of animal was rather familiar in people's mind. A few centuries later, a Roman author claimed that dragons lived in Ethiopia, far to the south, and Ethiopia would have been inhabited by a species of large dragons that hunted elephants and could grow to the length of 180 feet. The connections between Greek and Roman antiquity and European pagan mythologies are unclear. We don't exactly know what influence it may have had, but dragons were also abundant in Germanic and Norse mythologies. These are all the elements, all the influences that combined to develop the Western image of dragons in Europe during the Middle Ages. The snake-like dragons from Greco-Roman literature, references to dragons from the Near East that sometimes appeared in the Bible, and the Bible at the time in Christian medieval Europe was not a book to be questioned, so anything that appeared in it had to be considered absolutely real. And also European traditions from before Christianization. At this point in the Middle Ages, there were so many sources, including from far away in the past, that the existence of dragons looked absolutely plausible. Many people thought that they were real, living creatures. So dragons appeared in texts in which their anatomy was described, very much like our modern fantasy dragons: large wings, powerful jaws, horns, strong legs with claws. A famous medieval tale, including dragons, is an anecdote I told you about in the story about Arthurian legends. In the 12th century, a monk from Wales redacted Historia Regum Britanniae, which is a fantasy account of the history of the kings of Britain, and one of the founding texts of Arthurian literature. In the story, the young Merlin witnesses a warlord, Vortigern, attempting to build a tower in Wales to keep safe from the Anglo-Saxons. But the tower keeps being swallowed into the ground. Merlin informs Vortigern that underneath the foundations is a pool with 2 dragons sleeping in it. And this is the reason why the tower keeps sinking. The pool is drained, and 2 dragons are awakened. A red one symbolizing Wales, and a white one for England. They start fighting, and the white dragon triumphs, announcing the victory of England over Wales. We've seen earlier that dragons in East Asia were more benevolent. In medieval Europe, they were not. They became threatening figures, generally greedy, voracious, and living in rivers or having a cave or an underground lair. The legend of Saint George that reached Western Europe after the First Crusades only cemented the reputation of dragons as forces of evil. And yet, because they were also powerful and frightening, they also became a popular symbol in heraldry, like lions or towers. By the end of the Middle Ages, and even more in the following centuries, the hypothesis that dragons were real began to recede, because they were nowhere to be found. In the West, they turned into fabulous creatures in fairy tales, so they stayed in public's consciousness, and obviously they came to mind with the first steps of paleontology in the 18th century, when the fossils of large prehistoric creatures like dinosaurs started to be systematically studied. In the 19th century, there was no fantasy literature as we define it today. It is really something that was introduced in the 20th century, especially starting with Tolkien. Fantasy immediately made a heavy use of dragons, starting with Smaug from the novel The Hobbit. It's responsible for spreading or popularizing the image of the greedy dragon keeping its treasure in a cave, even though dragons keeping treasures already existed before in fairy tales and chivalry stories. Many authors have introduced their own stories with dragons since then, each of them with their particular take on dragons, but their anatomy and their behavior is immediately recognizable. They are like an emblem of fantasy, from Dungeons and Dragons to Harry Potter. Another aspect of dragons that was introduced in the 20th century is the friendly dragon in children's literature, and this seems really appealing to kids, maybe because the dragon becomes a powerful ally to battle the child's fear and make him feel special. Interestingly, in recent years, the depiction of dragons in films has changed a little for more realism and to take into account discoveries in paleontology. They are now depicted walking on their back feet and the wrists of their wings, like it is assumed pterosaurs did, for example in the Hobbit movies or in the Game of Thrones series. So this is it. Our stories are over for tonight, and I hope you enjoyed this exploration of the origins of supernatural fantasy creatures. You can now drift to restful sleep or pick another story. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.